So what we're going to do today, I wanted to talk about counteroffers, and the reason I wanted to talk about counteroffers is because I've been helping agents with them, and none of them are here today. Right? You know, that's how it goes. Nor are they online, so I'm sure they'll watch the video. How you doing, Silver? Counteroffers. Back in the old days, and there are two people here that might remember somewhat of the old days. Yes, you know who you are. You've been around a while.
Not too long.
Not too long, long enough.
3 years.
3 years. See, that's good enough. So back in the old days, 3 years and beyond, we had one counteroffer form. It was confusing. I used to make, if I could have charged people by the hour of explaining the counteroffer form, I wouldn't be here today because I'd have so much money I wouldn't have to, right? But we had one counteroffer form. It was complicated. It was confusing. People messed it up all the time. And the California Association of Realtors, who writes all of our forms, got tired of their legal department answering questions about counteroffer forms, so they made a new one, plural, right? We used to have one. There was you could use it for buyers, you could use it for sellers, you could use it for multiple counteroffers. They don't do that anymore. They've changed it to 3 different forms. So we're going to talk about that. And a couple of things that you should know about counteroffers before we get started. Notice I said must know. I don't usually use the M word that often. But anyhow, you must know that a counteroffer is a rejection. When I present counteroffers to sellers, I typically use these words. Well, I'll move it back up. So let's say you are my seller and I have an offer on your home. I would typically use these words. I would say, here's an offer. It's from so-and-so. You have 2 options. Option number 1 is you can accept the offer. And option number 2 is you can reject the offer. 2 options. Now, sometimes they would say, well, wait a second, don't we have a 3rd option? Can't we counter the offer? And the reality is that's a rejection. So once an offer's been countered, it's dead, it's gone, it's dead, you can't revive it, right? You understand? It's possible that the buyer might be willing. So if the offer is $675 and we counter you at $685 and you say no as the buyer, we can't now just say, okay, we were kidding, $675, we'll take it. We can't do that. We could say, all right, we'll take $675. And do you know what happens a lot of times? How do you feel when you're rejected? Are you happy? Somebody rejects you and then later they say, I didn't mean it, right? Come back, let's talk. A lot of times they say, no, I'm not going to talk. That offer's dead. It was good for the time. We gave it to you. It's over. We're done. Right? Did you understand? Once you've rejected it, there's no automatic right to re-accept it. And a lot of times the rejecting of it ticks people off and they won't deal with you under the same price and terms they had to begin with. You understand that? So should you explain it to a buyer or seller that countering has consequences, right? And the consequences are we might not make a deal. If you accept it, we have a deal. If you don't accept it, we may or may not have a deal. The other thing is that it's a new offer, right? So you understand that? A counteroffer is a new offer. And it's not binding until it is signed and delivered. So, and up until that moment, the other party could change their mind and do things. Just saying, they could revoke. So to make sure that part makes sense. The buyer makes an offer on your listing for 3 days. It's that night the seller is thinking of countering. The buyer could change their mind and pull back that offer, right? Do you understand? Even if it's been countered, they can still pull back that offer. There's handouts floating around here someplace. Silver is selling them for a nominal fee.
Thank you.
All right, sequence of events.
Take one. Thanks.
All right. Offer from buyer to seller, counter offer from seller is also called a maker, acceptance by buyer, deliver of acceptance to maker before expiration. And we're going to go through the actual form, and then confirmation of acceptance is not a legally required part, but it's a good thing to have because many of the issues, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, all right, many of the issues, I think I have enough copies, involve whether or not something was accepted and when was it accepted. Is there another copy?
Thank you.
You guys have to learn to share. Come on. All right. So let's look at, these are the different counteroffer forms that you could use. There's a seller counteroffer form, a buyer counteroffer form, and a seller multiple counteroffer form, which is the one that's certainly the most fun. So this is a lot of words, but what's the difference between the seller counteroffer and the buyer counteroffer? The obvious differences is one is for sellers, the other one is for buyers. I mean, that part I think is obvious. But the seller counteroffer has a withdrawal provision. I'm going to need to make other copies. I don't know. There is one, but we have 2 people. There's only one left.
I have 4.
You have 4.
Yeah, 1 copy.
All right. So, okay. All right. So this I know is a lot of words, but one of the differences between the seller counteroffer form is that it has more escape hatches than the buyer counteroffer form. It has a withdrawal provision in paragraph 2C that protects seller from being obligated to sell the property to 2 different buyers at the same time. The counteroffer is automatically withdrawn if seller accepts another offer prior to buyer's acceptance. You understand what that's saying is this is in the seller counteroffer form. If I have countered you and given you you represent the buyer, the counteroffer form, and I get another offer that comes in that's better than yours and I accept that, your counteroffer is automatically canceled, right? Normally, offers that are made are still out there and open until they've been revoked. But the seller counteroffer form says that if we counter you, you represent the buyer, we counter you and we get another offer that we like better than your offer and we accept it, your counteroffer is dead. It's a withdrawal provision. The counteroffer is automatically withdrawn if seller accepts another offer prior to buyer's acceptance. So should your buyers spend time, is there any more?
Mm-hmm.
Should your buyers, maybe not, spend time thinking about whether or not they're going to accept the counteroffer? I've been in the position as a listing agent where we had an offer, we countered the offer, and another offer came in $50,000 ahead of our counter. You know, and immediately we withdrew the counter offer we made, and the other agent claims that they had already accepted it, but it doesn't really matter because they never gave us a copy. So should the buyer sit around and wait, thinking about praying over it, talking to relatives? They might not get the house, right? Especially in the market we're in right now. There's also a paragraph entitled Marketing to Other Buyers, which informs the buyer that seller retains the right to market the property to other buyers, that the seller has the right to accept any other offer prior to buyer's acceptance of the seller's counteroffer. And then finally, there's an extra box in the first paragraph to allow the seller to counter the purchase agreement by incorporating it by reference. The buyer counteroffer form does not have this box as the buyer does not ordinarily respond to the seller's presentation of a purchase agreement. So the only difference is that the buyer's counteroffer, the seller's counteroffer has a box that says what is it that we're countering. I'm going to explain that. We're going to go through the form, but I just thought you would love to read all this. How do you keep track of the counteroffers? This can be confusing because in the old days it was counteroffer number 1. Jay, we have one. She has to decide where she wants to sit. She's going. Yeah, I told you after that last time. They don't want to sit next to anyone. So what makes this confusing, in the old days, there was one counteroffer form, and it always has a place to number it, which, by the way, sometimes agents don't fill in the numbers. But now there's two counteroffer forms. So if the buyer makes an offer and the seller counters it, that seller counteroffer, that obviously would sound like number one. If the buyer counters the seller counter, is that buyer counteroffer number one, or is it number two? Because there's already been a counteroffer number one, and the answer is nobody really knows or cares. Right? You understand? The California Association of Realtors legal department doesn't have a firm opinion on this. So you could choose. What most agents do is they leave the seller counter offers, because it's a different form, is 1, 2, 3 for the seller, and then the buyers are 1, 2, 3. I've had a whole stack of these going back and forth where people were picking over little tiny things. So it is everybody clear if the principles of many transactions, by the way, the reason why this is important is I've had cases where there was like a dozen of these going back and forth. It created this daisy chain of documents. And I can remember I used to have to print them out sometimes and sit on a big table and start stacking them up to make sure I had the right order of the different forms. And if agents don't number the form or they change the numbering system, I've had agents jump from 2 to 3, they jump from 2 to 4, they skip 3, right? And while we're wondering where is counteroffer number 3, and there is no number 3, you understand how this could become confusing, right? It's already confusing. Aren't you confused already just from me talking about it? So more than one counteroffer. By using this form, there's an easy way, hopefully, to sequentially keep track. So this is the description of, there's no real correct answer. Most agents have the first buyer counteroffer as number 1, the first seller counteroffer as number 1, and then the second would be, seller counteroffer would be number 2, and the third would be number 3. Does everybody understand that? I know it seems confusing, but the best way is to keep the seller counteroffers in their own numbering system and the buyer counteroffers in their own numbering system, right? We're actually going to look at one after which I know you're all waiting to. Wow, that's a lot of text. This comes up, and this may be this may be something you want to read tonight when you have, insomnia, but depending upon who you talk to, there's a difference in agreement as to whether or not arbitration, our mediation is sort of hardwired into our system. Arbitration or liquidated damages is a good or bad thing. So if you were to talk to a lawyer and ask a lawyer, if you were a seller, should I agree to arbitration? Should I agree to liquidated damages? The lawyer might say no. And the lawyers sometimes have a different opinion about liquidated damages versus arbitration. And the reason why some people don't like arbitration is you can't appeal. You understand? It doesn't matter if the arbitrator doesn't follow the law, ignores what the contract says, just does whatever the heck they want to. You can't appeal an arbitration. So you understand, if people talk to lawyers, lawyers may tell them do not agree to arbitration. Do you also understand it cuts down on business for lawyers? Right, you understand? Because if you get appealed, you can keep suing people and doing a lot more, right? So oftentimes this gets, by the way, if you have one of these, you might want to call me, just saying, right, and talk about it. But sometimes you'll see where the counter offer, so the buyer has initialed arbitration and liquidated damages, and the seller counters to remove arbitration. Right, and sometimes they try to remove liquidated damages because they want to have the right to sue the buyer for more than the deposit. Does everybody understand what liquidated damages says? Is that the buyer will forfeit their deposit up to 3% of the purchase price. And some sellers are greedy. I mean, they want more, right? They want the ability to go for more. So this is where it gets a lot more technical, is when they start countering arbitration or countering liquidated damages. Now, paragraph 1A, and we're going to look at the form. By the way, this is a form it wouldn't hurt you to read aloud a few times. And the reason I say read it aloud is that most real estate agents that I talk to have never read it until they actually have somebody that wants to counter. And then they're panicked and don't really understand, and they're having trouble explaining. You got to read it aloud. Paragraph 1A of both counteroffers, that means both the buyer and the seller counteroffer form, states that provisions such as arbitration or liquidated damages, which require initials by both parties, are excluded from the final agreement unless the paragraph is initialed by both parties in the original purchase offer. So if you could change that by putting a clause in the counteroffer, but if the buyer does not initial liquidated damages or does not initial arbitration and you don't address that in the counteroffer, then it's not part of the agreement. Is everybody with me? Let me know if I'm going to. When the seller initials arbitration paragraph in original purchase offer, but not liquidated damages. So sometimes what will happen is the buyer will initial both and then the seller doesn't, right? And also writes a counteroffer on the seller counteroffer form. Arbitration is included, but liquidated is not, because the seller initialed arbitration, but did not initial liquidated damages. And they just countered it. Now, what I'm saying here, which may not be obvious, is that typically we check a box that says that we're countering your offer subject to the attached counteroffer. But then they give you sometimes a copy of the whole contract, but they don't initial everything on the whole contract, right? They just don't. And they write a counteroffer. Basically, if the seller doesn't initial it on the contract and it's not included in the final agreement. Do you understand, if the seller has not initialed arbitration and there isn't something mentioned about that, it's not included in the contract. Do you understand? It will say maybe I'm not explaining this. From the look on your faces, I'm not sure I am. So the buyer makes an offer and the offer has liquidated damages and arbitration initialed. The seller counters price. The counter does not talk about arbitration or liquidated damages, but the seller does not initial one of those. Doesn't initial liquidated damages, only initials arbitration. Liquidated damages is not part of the contract because they didn't initial it. They don't have to say anything in the counteroffer because they didn't initial it. Do you understand, in the original offer? Was that clear? What did I say? I have no idea. When a seller does not initial either paragraph in the original offer and also writes a counteroffer without mentioning either arbitration or liquidated damages, neither of them are included. The seller does not initial. So what would that say you ought to do if you're a buyer and you get a counteroffer back with an attached offer? Should you just assume that the seller has initialed every place they're supposed to initial? Or should you look? And some people who bring me contracts to read notice I do it very quickly, right? It doesn't take me more than a minute to read somebody's contract because the problems are always in the same place every time, right? You understand? I know exactly where to look. And one of the places I look is, are liquidated damages and arbitration, are they initialed by everyone? Right? And if there's none, if the seller does not initial either paragraph in the original purchase offer and also writes a counteroffer, but specifically references arbitration in the counteroffer, seller agrees to arbitration as specified in paragraph 17, the arbitration clause is included, but liquidated damages is not. So if the seller does not initial either one, but says they agree to one, then that's included, but the other one is not. Am I making any sense at all?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if the buyer signs everything, the seller doesn't, so the final contract, the buyer is still bound to those rules and the seller is
No, if the question for those of you online is, what if the buyer signs arbitration, liquidated damages, and the seller does not? Then it means it's not binding on either party. Both of them have to initial it. Both of them have to agree for it to be incorporated in the contract.
So Mike, what exactly happened if the arbitration and the liquidation both are not checked? What exactly does it mean?
What exactly does it mean? Should you advise the buyer? First of all, the California Association of Realtors, and I'm sure you all know this, have a little booklet that you can download from their website that explains arbitration, liquidated damages, and mediation. Of course, you all knew that, right? It's written by, right, you all know that. It's written by the California Association of Realtors Legal Department. I'm saying that with a smirk because nobody ever seems to know that. But you could give them the little booklet. And the booklet sort of explains what liquidated damages, arbitration, mediation are. But if they have further questions, who should they talk to? What? A lawyer. Right? And lawyers generally don't like arbitration clauses because it reduces the amount of litigation. But having said that, what the booklet says is that arbitration may take less time, may cost less money, but it's binding and you can't appeal it. And the arbitrator does not have to follow either the contract or the civil code. And right, that's what it's going to say. But it may cost less money and it may take less time, which is why people do it. I'll say this even though I'm being recorded, the biggest advocate of this is mostly real estate agents. All right. And then liquidated damages is a little booklet you can give to people that explains what liquidated damages are, which says that the buyer may forfeit their deposit. However, it's not an automatic thing. So what that means is that if the buyer puts down a $20,000 deposit and then backs out of the agreement, liquidated damages, if you read it, seem to say that the seller gets to keep the money. But this is not an automatic forfeiture. The money is in escrow. The escrow is not going to give it to the seller unless one of three things happens. The buyer signs a form saying, I'm going to give up my deposit. They do not do this, right? They do not do this. So the only other two options are that it goes to arbitration, the arbitrator awards it, or if you haven't initialed arbitration, it goes to court and the court awards it. Otherwise, the money sits there. All right? Nobody gets it. Right? And by the way, if the seller resells the property for more than what you offered, which in our market is not unusual, there's a good argument to be made that there were no damages, therefore there should be no liquidated damages. So if our contract is for $900,000 and the buyer backs out and then the seller sells it to somebody else and gets $910,000, you understand an arbitrator is not going to give you the $25,000 deposit too. Right? They're going to say, well, you lucked out that they did not complete the deal and you got more money, you have no damages. How greedy are you? You want the liquidated damages too. But you understand if it gets into this, they should talk to a lawyer. Usually people at this point do not want to go hire a lawyer just to make a counteroffer, right? So you could give them the little booklets that come from the California Association of Realtors. You could print them out and hand it to them. Have you found them already? I didn't know. Anyhow, but can you understand how this could become an issue? Right? No?
Big issue.
Yes?
Sort of.
Sort of, all right. So why don't you do this? Call me when you have, let me look at your counteroffers. Is that a good idea? If the seller has used the SCO to exclude arbitration or liquidated damages, how can the buyer include them? The buyer has to counter. So sometimes what happens is you've included arbitration and liquidated damages and the seller has a brother-in-law who's an attorney. Sometimes sellers are lawyers. They're the worst, right? Because they want to write their own contracts. They want to go to court. They don't want to agree to anything. And so they'll counter out arbitration and liquidated damages. And to get them back in, the buyer has to put them back in, right? The buyer has to counter. And saying something, arbitration, liquidated damages as specified in paragraphs 21 and 22 are included in the final agreement. You actually have to say it. Hopefully that doesn't come up very often. One of the other questions that often comes up is what about down payment and purchase price and deposits? There's a clause in the new counteroffer form that says, and this is in both of them, that if we adjust the price, down payment is adjusted automatically. So if you write an offer and it's 20% down for 900,000 and it gets countered back at 950, it's 20% down of 950, it automatically adjusts. However, the deposit does not automatically adjust. So if the deposit, what is common now is to have a 3% earnest money deposit, right? But it's written in as a dollar amount. If this matters to you and your client and the prices goes up from 900 to 950, the deposit is not automatically increased. Down payment is automatically adjusted, but not the deposit. Could you understand having a conversation with your seller saying, well, the deposit has to be increased too, doesn't it? Since the price went up, the deposit is supposed to be, you said 3% is the most I could keep, and we've countered and the price went up, so the deposit's going up too, isn't it? The answer is no, it doesn't go up, not automatically. So if you want to change the deposit, you have to actually change the deposit. So if you represent this, do you understand the issues representing sellers and buyers are very different? The first counter offer almost always comes from the seller because the buyer is the one who makes the offer. So if you represent a seller and you want a 3% deposit and you raise the price, you've got to counter the deposit. How important is it to check the boxes? I see counter offers. At the top of the counter offers, it says this is a counter offer to the purchase agreement, and I see where nobody's checked any of the boxes. It's a counter offer, right? And so is that important? The short answer is yeah, it's like really important. First sentence of the counteroffer form says the terms and conditions of the above referenced document are accepted subject to the following. Now, I had a tendency, but I gave up, right? Because I'm willing to give instructions to real estate agents when I'm paid to do so. But I learned that trying to teach people that work at other offices in the middle of a transaction is sort of a waste of time, right? So what real estate agents typically want to do is to always throw in a paragraph, a line, a sentence in the counteroffer that says all other terms to remain the same, right? They go to some training where people tell you to do that. What does this say? The terms and conditions of the above referenced document are accepted subject to the following, which, by the way, means all other terms and conditions remain the same. But I've learned that if I don't actually say that, people get all weird, right? Because they say, well, what about all the other terms and conditions? Are they the same? And I got tired of reading the counteroffer to them, so I even put it in now too. It also makes the client feel a little bit happier because it says all the terms and conditions remain the same. Most lawyers would tell you that if you try to restate something that's already in the form, it's a bad idea, right? Because if you're being sued, they would be asking, oh, GJ, why did you write that in? Isn't that already in the contract? Well, were you trying to change it somehow?
Like
right? And you're like, I don't know. You know, you say, Mike told me to do it.
Like Bush does.
Right, Mike told me that he put it in. He wrote my counter. By using the counteroffer form, the offeror is accepting all the terms of that prior offer. So if you don't write all other terms and conditions are the same, does it mean you're not bound by the other terms and conditions? No, the form already says that. You need to understand that the only thing you're accepting the offer except for those things you write on this form, right? You can't later say, well, I didn't like that part.
But if you don't check the litigation, and so if you're, that means that the prior form is valid.
Well, first of all, it causes trouble if you don't check the right box that says we are countering the residential purchase agreement. Dated, in other words, you're supposed to specify what form you're countering. and not just leave the boxes unchecked. All right. When several rounds of counteroffers made, a document chain is formed, which accepts all the terms of the prior document. So seller makes a counteroffer, it's accepting all the terms of the original offer. The buyer counters the seller counter, the only changing one thing, basically that accepts everything else in the counteroffer. Do you understand? Each time you do this, you're accepting everything that came before except that which you specifically refer to. Is everybody with me on this? Does that mean, thus a counteroffer which does not reference the counteroffer that immediately preceded it may be a radically different agreement than one that includes all the counteroffers. In other words, a lawyer could be saying, well, you're not including everything because you didn't reference it, right? Did you understand if you don't reference the prior document, then a legal argument could be made that you weren't including it, which causes trouble, right? Am I making you, all right, we're going to look at an actual form. How can a seller or buyer withdraw a counteroffer that they have made? This is often misunderstood. First of all, there's a WOO form. Did you know that there's a form actually called the WOO form? The withdrawal of offer. The basic method for withdrawing a counteroffer is to communicate. This could be done in writing, but need not be. In other words, I've mentioned this, I've warned everyone that I use tracking software. Right? Anytime I send anyone an email, there's a little code hidden in the email that tracks whether you opened it or not. If you're saying, I don't have that, I don't want to buy it, I actually spend a little bit of money on it, E-Edge, the Keller Williams system, includes tracking software. So if you're communicating with somebody using the E-Edge system, the software will tell you if they opened and read, or opened at least, your email. But legally, if I call you and I say we withdraw our counteroffer, that's good enough. This can be done in writing. In fact, the withdrawal of offer form allows an agent to simply call up the other agent and orally withdraw a counteroffer or offer.
Is it after the counteroffer delivered?
Yes. So I give you, you present an offer on my listing in Dearborn, which I've been waiting, right? And we counter it. You offer $675, we counter $685, and then Jay brings in an offer for $690. I call you up and I say, you know, we're withdrawing our counteroffer. That's all I have to do. Call you and tell you. Now, could we get into an argument whether I called him and told him, right? So I send you an email that says we're withdrawing our counteroffer. You still haven't gotten a copy of any official form, right? But the WOO form actually says all we have to do is call the other agent and tell them we're withdrawing our counteroffer. I like to send emails because I have the tracking software. I can prove that they at least opened it.
Is it from both sides? From buyer can also do the same thing?
Yes, anybody can withdraw any offer until it has been accepted and the acceptance has been communicated and delivered back. And you can do so for any reason or no reason. Immediately, you should have the seller or buyer sign the WOO form, which should then be delivered promptly. Having withdrawn a counteroffer verbally, the WOO form is functioning to confirm it. Because sometimes agents will say, well, you never told me that they're withdrawing it, you know. The SCO, which is the seller counteroffer, allows another possibility. The seller's acceptance of another offer from a different buyer automatically cancels the counteroffer. All right, without even telling you. I just have to prove that I did. By the way, is there a place on the form to write in time? Say yes.
Yes.
Could that be important at some point, what time something was actually done?
Yes.
Yes. Could it be really important? One of the nice things about using the digital ink or SkySlope, the electronic signatures, is it timestamps it. But can you imagine, I've been in arguments over what time somebody withdrew something or changed something. All right. Isn't this fun? I thought I wouldn't have enough material to cover this, but how can a seller make simultaneous counteroffers to two or more buyers? That's form number 3. So form 1 is the seller counteroffer. Form 2 is the buyer counteroffer. Form number 3 is the seller multiple counteroffer. I think I reversed the initials on one of them. Anyhow, but you can counteroffer a whole bunch of them. So let's say I get 10 offers. I can counter all 10 of them. And each counter could be different. I might counter Jay's offer on price. I might leave Russell's price alone, but tell him he has to remove his contingency in 12 days. I might have somebody else's. Everyone could be different, right? Seller signs paragraph 5 in the seller multiple counteroffer is delivered to buyer. Buyer accepts by signing under paragraph 7. Now what's confusing is that if I've countered 5 offers, I have a multiple counter offer, it actually says in paragraph 7, buyer's acceptance. So Jay might think that when his buyer signs the buyer's acceptance, that they like accepted and it's an actual contract, but that is not true because there's no binding agreement until seller re-signs under paragraph 8. So I send out 5 counteroffers, and by the way, it's not a horse race, right? Jay's got 6 people saying right away, and he sends it back to me. Doesn't matter, right? I could wait, right? I could wait until I get them all back. We might like the last one. So a seller who has written multiple counteroffers under no obligation to re-sign any of the counteroffers actually return to the seller. Now this is arguably acting in bad faith, but I send out 5 counteroffers. I represent the seller. I get 5 acceptances back. And my client says, wow, people really want my house. Why don't we throw them all away, raise the price, and keep going? Right? You understand? We don't have to accept any of them. We're under no obligation to pick one.
Because that's a new offer, right?
If I get an offer, 5 offers, I counter all 5, I raise the price, everybody accepts them right away. Do you think my client might think that they didn't ask for enough? Right?
Yeah.
Right? Because if we were pushing the limit, somebody would have dropped out. So why don't we push the limit a little bit more? Does everybody understand there's a misunderstanding in the business by many agents that the seller has to accept one of them? Yeah.
So do we remove the home from the market for 30 days? Or we set that
No, you
clock?
don't have to. They just raise the price if you want to.
So you keep the clock.
What you could do is, what I did, because I've had this actually happen, is I called everyone up. And by the way, what I would be telling you to do, if you were asking my advice, and there were 5, and it was a multiple counteroffer form, this is what I would say. So Jay is one that you got, it says multiple counteroffer, right? And I would ask you, how bad does your client want to buy this house?
Really bad.
Really bad. So we're going to counter the multiple counteroffer form.
Okay.
And what we're going to do is raise the price. All right? You understand? We're not going to accept the multiple counteroffer form. We're going to counter it. And we're going to raise the price. Does that increase the chances that his buyer is going to end up owning this house?
Yeah.
All right? Because if everybody accepts it, I'm thinking we didn't push hard enough. Right? So did you understand? This is why it's good. It would be good to talk to me. Didn't I ask how bad does your buyer want to buy this house? I asked that question, right? How bad does your buyer want to buy this house? Well, don't just accept the multiple counteroffer. Because, by the way, is it possible that a real estate agent is being deceptive when they use the multiple counteroffer form and they really don't have, you're the only offer? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Is there any way, now technically that's not acting in good faith, it's not being fair and honest, but how can you prove that the agent doesn't have more offers? I don't know how to do that. So is it possible that they're doing this just to mess with you?
Yeah.
Right, it's possible, right? But if they do have multiple offers and you really want to get the house, don't just accept it. Bump it up a little, right? How bad? That's why it's good to talk to me about this, right? I see a Christian. I'm surprised I haven't got, if a seller makes just one counteroffer and the buyer accepts it, it is received by seller to seller, have to accept. The answer is yes, if the seller does not use the multiple counteroffer form. If the seller is just doing the counteroffer form, not multiple counteroffer form, and the buyer accepts it and the acceptance is communicated and delivered back to the seller or the seller's agent, we have a contract. The only time the seller has a right to not keep going is if it's the multiple counteroffer form. Which is why some agents, whether they're supposed to or not, use the multiple counteroffer form even when they don't have multiple counteroffers. Which is not, even though I'm not saying you should do that.
They reserve the right to accept other
Right.
more.
By the way, just to be clear, the basic seller counteroffer form says, hardwired into it, that the seller has the right to continue to market the property, and if the seller accepts any other offer, it kills the counteroffer. That's already in the form. But if the counter is accepted, then it's a done deal, if that acceptance is delivered and back. Does this make sense to everyone?
Yeah, so multiple counteroffer is better.
Well, the multiple counteroffer can be better. However, it depends on how the market is going. I generally have taken the attitude it's better to be honest than to be dishonest. Because if Jay's buyer, if I give him a multiple counteroffer form and I do not have multiple counteroffers, is it possible his buyer, when Jay says, well, how bad do you want to buy this house, might say, not that bad. Not that bad, right? If this is going to be a bidding war, I'm out, go find me another house, right? Is that possible? I don't know. So I'm taking a risk by saying it's a multiple counter offer when it's not. I'm taking a risk. So I would not advise you to do that if you represent the seller. I would tell you don't do it. Because when you drive that person away and the seller is angry with you, and the seller's mad at you, then you're
But like if you counter someone's counter, like if I put 610 for this house and he give me this multiple counter thing, and then I said, no, I'm not accepting this. I'm sticking to my offer, whatever
right.
So we can do that too.
You can do that too. You don't have to accept the counteroffer, and sometimes I've countered back the counteroffer because of time periods, right? You understand the original one has a clock. It says 3 days if you don't change it, and so when that time period ends, that one is dead, and so sometimes you just counter back at the same price. I've countered back at the original price. So 900 is our offer. The seller comes back at 950. I've countered back at 9. Or whatever it was. I just countered back at the original price. Right? To say no, the original. It's still part of the conversation. But if you just ignore it, you understand? If you just ignore it, then everything dies. Then everything just dies. No contract is created until the seller subsequently re-signs in paragraph 8 and delivers the re-signed form back to the buyer. Is it important that you understand this? All right, so that or call me. Must the confirmation of acceptance be signed to create a binding agreement? The answer is no. Transaction coordinators sometimes will say yes. Agents will say yes. I've been in a class where the agent raised their hand and said, isn't the confirmation of acceptance required in order to keep make it a binding agreement? And the person in front of the class said, yes, I'm sure, yeah, it's a part of the form. If you read the form, and we're going to look at the form, it actually says right next to it, this is not required to create a binding contract. Do you understand? I make an offer and you accept and communicate and deliver the acceptance back to me. We have a contract. My confirming back to you is not required by law to create anything. Why do we have it? Just to make sure everyone knows that it was received, right? Just to be clear, but it is not a requirement. I think I just sort of said all that. Other things, let's say if an agent for the buyer or seller personally receives a accepted counteroffer, does that create a binding agreement? It can, but only if paragraph 2 on the seller or buyer counteroffer or paragraph 6 is filled in with the name of the agent. One of the things that I always look for when you show me a purchase contract or a counteroffer, one of the things I immediately look for to see if you've written your name in where it says who could receive the communicated acceptance. Now, if you do not write your name in, then it means that it has to be given to it's not a deal until the buyer gets it, let's say, or the seller gets it. But if you do write your name in, then, or the agent writes their name in, then their receipt is considered acceptance. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? If you let's start with the offer. If you write an offer and on the paragraph where it says acceptance of the offer and you don't write your name in, what it says is the buyer has to actually get the copy of the acceptance in order to have a contract. That means giving it to the buyer's agent is not good enough. Now, if I'm the listing agent, I don't like that because I don't know the seller's email. I can't send them an email with tracking software, and proving that Jay got it doesn't prove that Jay's client got it, right? It's, by the way, better tracking software could prove that too. But you understand why it's way better to just say the agent's receiving it is good enough. But you got to put the name in. If the name is not there, then you haven't agreed to the agent being the one who could receive it. If those paragraphs are left blank, then the counter offer must be personally received by buyer or seller who made it. Right? Which is not the best situation. Isn't this fun? So I made a checklist. Actually, it's a checklist I made a long time ago, but I revised it for the market. So in the purchase agreement, maybe I didn't actually say that, there's a box to check that says you're accepting it subject to the attached counteroffer. That's in the purchase agreement. And then there's a place to put in the date. I have learned to tell agents, don't have the seller sign the offer right away. Have them sign the counteroffer, because I've actually had cases where the agent had the seller sign the offer, forgot to check the box subject to the attached counteroffer, and then sent it to the other agent. And the other agent lost the counteroffer and said, we got you. You didn't check the box that says it's attached to it's subject to the attached. You didn't check the box and you signed it. We've got a contract without a counteroffer. So I have learned, even though if you learn, a lawyer would say, best practices are you're supposed to sign the purchase agreement. The seller's supposed to sign the purchase agreement and attach it with the counteroffer. There is more room for problems if you do that. Do you understand? So also it's a pain in the ass. Sorry, it's a pain, right? Because they have to go through and they have to initial every little thing, they have to sign every little thing, and then the buyer may not accept the counteroffer anyhow. So I found that it's both easier to just have them sign the counteroffer and not have them do the whole purchase contract, because you might screw up and send them the signed purchase contract without the counter offer, or forget to check the box subject to the attached counter offer. Do you understand how you might do that? However, should you be making it very clear to the seller that they're accepting everything in that contract except those things that are being countered? Should you make that really clear? Because later so anyhow, that's not exactly what would be considered the best practice, but I've defaulted to this just because I got tired of talking to lawyers. When the seller was suing us because the agent had messed us up. I used to work for a company that had over 600 agents, and I was the guy who got to talk to lawyers, which is, yeah. Always make sure that agency relationship is confirmed properly. I see lots of contracts where they don't have Keller Williams Silicon City represents the buyer exclusively. They don't say Intero represents the seller exclusively. They don't have those boxes checked on the purchase contract. I see it all the time. By the way, it's one of the things I look for right away. Those of you that have sent me offers know it doesn't take me very long to read them, right? Because it's just, I go right, and by the way, failure to properly confirm agency, according to the California Civil Code, could mean they don't have to pay you a commission, right? One of the ways in which they get people to confirm agency, real estate agents, is because the code says if you screw this up, they don't have to pay you. Right? So one of the things when you're writing a counter, you might want to make sure that so if you represent the seller, the agent representing the buyer is the one who failed to check the boxes. So would you want, if you represent the seller, to say Keller Williams Realty Silicon City is confirmed as representing the seller exclusively, and Intero Realty is confirmed as representing the buyer exclusively? You want to say that. You should make sure that the price is right. Look at the interest rate on the financing section. All right, one of the sneaky things that agents will do is they will put in an interest rate they can't get just to give themselves a way out. All right, do you understand? Whatever it is the lender says, they'll knock a little bit off just to give them an out. This is assuming you have a loan contingency. If you don't have a loan contingency, don't worry about it. You should make sure, this is just what you should focus on, about personal property excluded or included. Right, I'm just saying these are the things that I used to get calls about from lawyers because the seller did not want to include the refrigerators, but it was checked by the buyer. And then and by the way, the listing, which is important, the listing contract, the multiple listing service, or the purchase agreement in determining who gets to keep stuff. The purchase agreement, it actually says it trumps whatever the MLS says or what the listing agreement says. So do you think the seller thinks because they told you and you wrote it in the listing agreement that they don't get the refrigerator and the MLS says they're not included? Is it possible that you and the seller aren't paying close attention to that clause? And that the buyer has checked the box that said refrigerators are included. Guess who's going to end up buying the seller a refrigerator? It's not me. Right? I'm just telling you. Make sure close of escrow and delivery of possession meets the seller's needs. If the seller is renting back, work out all the provisions now for the rental, not later. I have agents that just say, oh, the seller's going to rent back. And then 2 weeks before escrow closes or a week before escrow closes, they're trying to hash out how much. Now, even if you say it's a free rent back, who's paying for utilities? Did you know that a homeowner policy for insurance generally does not cover renters? So the seller's homeowner policy ends when the seller no longer owns the property. The buyer's homeowner policy does not include rentals, which means that the property is uninsured during the rent back period. Uninsured during the rent back period. Now, could we get a renter's policy? I'll tell you, the insurance person who sold the buyer their homeowner policy would love to sell them another policy. But who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for utilities? Who's going to pay for this stuff? right? When do you want to work this out? When everybody is happy and making an offer, or later? The same things if the buyer moves in early. You gotta work it out now rather than working it out a few days before escrow closes, or delete all contract provisions that are not agreeable to seller and or those that you intend to change. Always delete anything that is unclear. If the agent has written a clause in the contract and you do not understand it, delete it. Right? You could call me if you can't. Do you understand? I say, don't just accept. Don't say, I really didn't understand what he meant. You know, yeah, I saw it, but I didn't understand what it meant. If you don't understand what it means, say, delete it.
On that number 6, back to number 6, what about the liability and fire insurance?
Well, that's what I meant. Fire insurance, that's what I'm talking about, is a policy. That's the insurance policy I'm talking about.
That's not covered?
No, that's what I'm talking, it's no, generally a homeowner's policy includes fire and other things. But it doesn't include the property being rented out, because it's a homeowner's policy. I'm just saying if
That
it's,
period of the rental.
For the rental-
old owner, if they're.
the owner's policy ends when the owner no longer owns it.
Right.
This buyer's policy doesn't include rental, because it's a homeowner's policy.
So the house would be covered, but the things.
It's not
inside
covered,
the
it's
house-
nothing's
It's very
covered.
critical.
No, I'm telling you that if you don't tell your insurance agent what you're doing during that 2-week period, there isn't any insurance in place.
And if the house burns?
If the house burns, then they're suing you for not talking to them about this when they wrote it up in the first place. Then the final thing I did is I have a sample letter that you could include or email.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But usually if you have a loan, you have to have an insurance.
I know you have to have insurance, but a homeowner's insurance policy does not include the property being rented out. It's a homeowner's policy. It doesn't have a tenant's package automatically included. And during that 2-week rent back, it's not covered. Yeah.
So why are you paying if you're not?
Well, so what you have to do is call the insurance agent up and say, we have a 2-week rent back. How do we make sure it's covered? And they'll say, well, you just have to give me your credit card number and we'll issue you a policy. Right? So do we need to look at the form? I mean, I've pretty much done this, but the form, so the first one, I'm going to give you homework because I have to go someplace else. So the seller counter offer number 1, notice how they're all numbered?
Yeah.
But they don't rot, right? You'll see what I mean. So even though it said number 1, notice it says number 1, we put in today's date for doing it today. The purchase agreement, or it could be a buyer counter offer. Notice the numbers. The rest of this is pretty much self-explanatory. Confirmation of acceptance is not, it says here a binding contract is created. It doesn't include this. You might want to read the form, right? Read the form. You got a copy of my handout. You might call me when you have a counter offer. How about that? Does that sound like a good idea? Call me if you have a counter offer. All right, are you guys happy online?